I'm Father Ron Schmidt, a Jesuit priest, part of the Rabbi-Priest Dialogue Group of the Los Angeles Archdiocese, founded by the Archdiocese of Los Angeles and the Board of Rabbis of Southern California.
And I'm Rabbi Adam Greenwald. I'm director of the Miller Introduction to Judaism program at American Jewish University, and I've been really lucky to be part of this priest-rabbi dialogue for the last few months, and it's been so nice to get to know you.
Great. Good to know you. And today we're talking about science and religion, and in our faith traditions, the compatibility or non-compatibility of science and religion in our traditions. So where does that come from? How does the Jewish tradition deal with the so-called science and religion controversy?
Well, first of all, and I'm sure that this is also true in the Catholic tradition, there is no one answer to any single question. What do Jews believe about? Well, Jews believe a lot of things about a lot of things. And in fact, if you put two Jews in one room and ask them a question, you are guaranteed at minimum three opinions. So I can say, though, in general, that in my understanding of the Jewish tradition, our tradition has never been hostile to the concept of science, to the scientific process, the idea of inquiring for truth and testing hypotheses to try to come to a greater understanding of how the world works. In fact, that's seen as a way of showing reverence for God, right? We read in the Psalms, how good are your works, how deep are your designs, and the more that we can look into those works, the more that we can understand those designs, the better we can understand God who set them into motion.
Well, of course, for Catholics, it's kind of much the same, but the controversy arises, I think, over the issue of evolution and the beginning of the universe, so to speak, or the beginning of humans. One of the questions that we learned as Jesuits is, what do you mean by this? In other words, what do you mean? What do we mean by, we use this phrase religion and science, and there's controversy over whether they're compatible, parallel, or not, harmonious kind of thing. But what do we mean, when we use these phrases, what do we mean by science? Frequently, do we mean chemistry? Is there some controversy about chemistry or physics? I think what we need to do is really kind of drill down to that controversy that talks about evolution, which raises all sorts of issues, or the beginning of the universe, as you said off camera. Is it 5,700 years ago? Is that what it is? How do you get there? Let's just take evolution and the beginning of the universe, or how things started.
Well, so for this, I want to give credit to one of my great teachers, a rabbi named Chaim Seidler-Feller, who for 40 years was the director of UCLA's Hillel Center, the Jewish Outreach Center. I remember being probably 17 or 18 and sitting in on a class of his where he asked us to open up the book of Genesis, which of course we both share, and to read the first chapter of Genesis and the creation story. And he mapped it out on the board, right? On day 1, light and dark. On day 2, land and sea and sky. And then he said, okay, so the creation story is done, right? Well, how about you turn the page to chapter 2? And in chapter 2, the creation story starts all over again. And he had us then map out that second creation story. And we held up the map of 1, and we held up the map of 2. And he said, are these two stories compatible with one another? And of course, in Genesis chapter 1, man and woman are created at the same moment at the completion of creation. And in Genesis chapter 2, man is created first, then all of the plants and animals, until ultimately woman comes about as the pinnacle of creation, as we all know, or at least as my wife tells me. He said, either everything comes before people, or people come before everything else. It can't be both. He said, so there's two possibilities. Either the person who put together the Bible, God or people, doesn't matter here, didn't notice that the text was being poorly edited, but that seems unlikely, or this was a purposeful choice. And the purposeful choice was to say, from the very beginning of the text, we're going to present you with two stories in tension, which mean that this text can't be a text like a science textbook.
Science text,
Or it can't be a history book. It needs to be read differently. He said you could think about it as a big red blinking warning sign practically on the cover of the book saying, read differently. And for me, his teaching has been where I have started in my own thinking about these questions, to say, I'm not sure that our biblical tradition insists that we believe in anything like a literal creation story, because it doesn't even just give us one literal creation story. I don't know, how does that resonate with you and with the church's current stance on these issues?
The church's current stance would be to go back to the kind of the Big Bang theory, that God created this entire universe. And we have these stories of creation and beginnings, but they are people's understanding at that time of, and trying to get a handle on what happened.
Yeah.
And to kind of describe in their own simple terms as how it all began. But you asked, how does the church see it? The Catholic Church is perfectly willing and able to see the story of the beginnings as far back as the Big Bang Theory, and to work with that. It's very interesting when I say Big Bang Theory. I was in church one day preaching, and I happened to mention, and there was a group of children in the Mass, and I said something about the Big Bang Theory. I'm not sure why. Mm-hmm. And from the back row, about 5 rows back, one child raised his hand and said, well, what's the Big Bang Theory? And then I think one of the other children up there even answered that at the beginning of the universe, a second grader or something. So the Catholic Church is willing to understand, really understands that, and sees science and our faith and our religion as harmonious. They can be together. Now, of course, the next question people ask me is, well, what about Galileo? The church, went against Galileo, and they had the Inquisition and banned his books for a while because he said that the center of the universe was the sun, and the understanding at that time was, no, it's the earth. We're the center here, and that's how God created it. But after that controversy, the church kind of grew in their understanding and began to understand and appreciate science differently. And of course, this was at the beginning of the Age of Reason, the Enlightenment. Right. All sorts of things were going on economically, politically, faith-wise, philosophically. Science was becoming, science method was really getting laid in concrete. So all sorts of things were changing at that time, but the question frequently is, well, look what you said with Galileo.
Right, and I would say certainly also for the Jewish tradition, we have our own complicated relationship with these questions. One of my favorite Jewish thinkers, one of the greatest Jewish thinkers of all times, is Maimonides, the 12th century Jewish philosopher, teacher, and also medical doctor, who said, famously in his writings, that if you don't understand science, you can't possibly understand God. In one of the last chapters of his Guide for the Perplexed, he describes God like a king in a castle and says those people who study only faith but don't also learn science are like people trying to get in to see the king who can only make it as far as the courtyard but can't actually make it into the throne room. Right? Good people of faith, but because they don't understand the scientific process, because they don't understand the world around them, they can't possibly come close to God. And he said this teaching in the 12th century seems very, very progressive. Of course, throughout the last 800 years, there have been groups of Jews who have gotten together, Jews, mind you, and burned Maimonides' works. The Guide for the Perplexed was publicly burned by Jewish communities who said, how dare he say something like this? So I don't think that any religious tradition, 2,000 years old or 3,000 years old, is ever going to be monolithic on these sorts of questions. So I don't hold Galileo against you, if you won't hold the burning of the Guide against us.
I don't think we will. But wasn't Maimonides' writings kind of lost for a while, this whole idea?
Well, so Maimonides wrote Jewish legal writings, what's called the Mishnah Torah, a sort of summary of Jewish law, which is on the shelf in every Beit Midrash, in every Jewish study hall throughout the world. His Guide for the Perplexed, his philosophical work, that was the work that, if it wasn't lost, was much less likely to find its way onto the shelves of an Orthodox study hall, because even today it would be considered a bit dangerous in some of its ideas. Things like the question about science, or what happens when biblical text contradicts reason. And Maimonides says in the guide, when biblical text comes in contradiction to reason, biblical text must yield. Because if God is ultimately reasonable, and we can prove something by reason, then to insist on an unreasonable biblical text is to make God a fool.
Okay.
That didn't always go down so easy among the religious authorities of his day, and even today there would be some people who would take exception.
Well, I think also that there's a parallel between what you're saying and Galileo, because he was writing far in advance many scientific things, far in advance of his time, whether it was Copernicus and all sorts of writings. But one of the things that I wanted to be sure we just touched on a little bit before we ended was that the church has some ethical issues or moral issues with how far science can go.
Yes.
Okay. And so one of those issues is related to cloning. Can we take science too far and play God? How do we do that? Should we do that? So, as the church says, the idea of cloning, also a very controversial issue on in vitro fertilization, you're playing God. And so dogmatically we say we can't do that.
Sure.
We can't take things out of what we would call the natural flow or the natural law. And so there is how science, we look at it. The Catholic Church says, well, kind of wait a minute. There are ethical and moral issues, whether it's death and dying. How do we play God in that? In euthanasia. Can we do that? We cannot do that. So there are limits. Science can go so far, but at the same time, we need to look at the moral implications.
I think I very much resonate with the overall questions, even if our traditions might come down in slightly different places on some of the specifics. But science asks and answers questions about, can we do something? Science doesn't offer insight in whether we should do it or not, right? And I think it's telling the story of Dr. Oppenheimer, right? The physicist, probably the physicist most responsible for the creation of nuclear weapons, who then spent the rest of his life as an advocate against those weapons that he had a role in creating. Just because the science is possible doesn't mean that morally we should be going down every direction that's open. And I feel like as technology continues to accelerate, as more and more things become possible, these kind of questions are only going to become more and more urgent for people of faith and people of conscience to be thinking through together.
And I think that's exactly right, especially now with the technology and all that's going on in technology and science. We need to be able to step back and say, should we?
Yes.
Should we be doing this? And I like that phrase, just because we can and we have the knowledge and the understanding and we have the technology, should we continue to do that? And there's one side of the stance that says, of course we should. We should just go, let it go, let it go. And our religious traditions are the ones that are going to say, time out, wait a minute, we need to look at it. Should it be done? Even though we can do it. And I think that's for the secular world and for the world at large, it's not a bad idea to say, hey, stop and ask the questions, should we be doing this? Is it morally, ethically viable or to be done?
Wisdom comes from the pausing, doesn't it?
I like that. Wisdom comes from the pausing. And in this environment, in the world we're in, sometimes we're not pausing. Yeah. We're letting the wisdom, even if it's wisdom, I'm not sure it is. It may be just the idea that we can do it, but we need to we need to pause and let wisdom take forth, shine forth. And so thank you for being with us today, and I'm glad we could share this time together. And we look forward to more conversations of the Rabbi-Priest dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you.